What's up? How's it going? Oh, all right.
Well, I realized how jealous I am that with the majors here, other people can listen to music all day.
I know, right? Definitely been an interesting experience teaching here.
So legacies are independent, really closely to. But okay, also keep it good. It's a previous version. Yeah. So I have, we were there last year. And I'm actually currently employed as a site engineer in San Diego. And so knowing that I already had like industry local experience, and that's all I had. Right, right, right. Just knowing all of those, that's something I'm probably. I mean, so it's not all just, you know, more than concessions. So, I get it. Right, right.
All right, it's 4 o'clock. Let's go and get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Good to hear. Before we start today, I have kind of a funny story to tell. So I visited my parents last night. I don't see them enough, but you know, so it was nice to see them. We were watching TV, and then there was a political ad that came up. So if you live in Orange County, you may be familiar. There's a congressional battle going on. On one side, there's I think she's the incumbent. Her name is Michelle Steele, and then she's going against someone named Derek Tran. So you know, if you watch political ads nowadays, you'll know the meta is kind of, you know, not to make ads to, you know, make yourself look good, is to make ads to make the other person look bad. And so she ran an ad, and then the end of her ad was the kind of her catchphrase, which was "Don't trust Tran." I was like, what the hell, man? Like, what did I do to you, Michelle? What the heck? And my dad's like, she can't say that. That's your cousin. I'm like, is he really my cousin? But my dad's like, no. But he said, you never know. There's so many of us trans, and so we might be related. I don't know, but yeah, kind of a funny story. But not, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, to tell you, you know, how to vote or anything like that. You know, that's not my place. But you know, just kind of a funny story that I thought I'd share with you guys. Okay, back to biomechanics, and so the plan for today. We have a little bit more of the muscle dynamics notes that we want to cover, that I want to cover. We covered 1 out of 5 of the characteristic, you know, parameters for the muscles. And so we're going to finish that up, and then we're going to move on to motion capture. So talking about human motion kinematics and how all that works. Okay. All right. Just one more announcement. So I did bring your exams again today. These are midterm 1. Today is going to be the last day that I bring it to class, and so if you don't pick it up today, I'll still have them, but you just have to come to my office to pick them up. Sorry, that pop-up was bugging me. Okay, any questions I can answer before we get started for today? Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and pick up where we left off. So actually, first thing, let me scroll up a little bit just to kind of remind you where we were. Okay, so last time, we spent the entire lecture talking about, how do we characterize muscle performance? That's with regards to its instantaneous length and its instantaneous velocity, right? So we talked about, this force velocity curve and then this force length curve. Okay, so that kind of dominated our discussion last time. Those curves that we talked about were curves that were specific to sarcomeres. And so sarcomeres being kind of the smallest building blocks of your muscles. And so, what the discussion we kind of started with at the end of lecture last time was that each of your muscles in your body are all different sizes and shapes and lengths and so on and so forth. And so, to take those results, the force length relationships and the force velocity relationships, we need a little bit more information to take those results and apply them to each individual muscles. And so what we're basically saying is that there's 5 kind of properties here that basically allow us to take those results, the force length curve and the force velocity curves, and apply them to each individual muscle. Okay. So the first parameter that we went through was called the optimal fiber length, which was kind of like a generalization of this idea of an optimal sarcomere. Okay. And what we said was that the optimal fiber length that a muscle needs to be to produce the maximum amount of force is simply just an integer multiple of the optimal sarcomere length. Okay. So this parameter LOM, okay, is equal to n, where this little n here is the number of sarcomeres within that muscle fiber, okay, multiplied by this range right here. With this range here, if you recall, this 2.2 to 2.7 microns, this is the optimal sarcomere length for producing the maximum amount of force. Okay. All right. And kind of the main motivating factor behind this formula here was the fact that if you look at a muscle fiber and you look at it underneath a microscope, then you'll see that it's just a chain of all these little sarcomeres kind of linked together in series. Okay. And so what does that mean for our force length curve and our force velocity curve? Well, to talk about these kind of specifically, we have to kind of look at each individual muscle. But what I kind of really want you guys to kind of remember is this difference between a short muscle versus a long muscle. Okay. So there's a lot of muscles in your body that can be considered short. So those are the ones where the fibers are not very long, versus a longer muscle where the fibers are very long because the muscle has to stretch, probably across an entire limb or to cross over multiple joints and so on. Okay. And so kind of the difference between a short muscle and a long muscle, has to do with the fact that, longer muscles have more sarcomeres that are linked together in series. Okay. And so you end up with a difference in curves like this. Okay. So for a short muscle, what ends up happening is that you have a force length curve with a very narrow plateau. Okay. Oftentimes it's higher. You have a higher kind of peak force for your shorter muscles, but we'll kind of get into that a bit later. Whereas for the long muscles, you have a very extended plateau. Okay. Okay, so there's a very wide range of lengths for longer muscles that they can operate at kind of maximum force. Okay, but the peak is usually smaller, and so the peak force for a long muscle is usually kind of smaller. And again, we'll kind of get into that reason a bit later. Okay. And then if we look at the difference between the force velocity curves, for a longer muscle, they can operate at higher force at higher velocities for longer. Okay, so you usually kind of have these two curves where, for a shorter muscle, at higher velocities, the muscle force tends to decay very, very rapidly. Whereas for a longer muscle, the decay is a little bit slower. Okay. Eventually, both curves reach a point where you will move at a high enough speed such that the muscle force is really small, but the long muscle can have higher forces at certain velocities. Okay. Okay, so that was kind of the number one parameter that we talked about. Okay, and so we're going to go over parameters 2, 3, 4, and 5 today as well. But that was just kind of a recap from last time. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. All right, so let's talk about the second parameter. So the second parameter we mentioned before, and so this is a little bit of a repeat of kind of what we talked about previously with muscles. The second parameter that determines a muscle's performance is its pennation angle. Okay. All right, so just to kind of refresh your memory, most muscles or, a lot of muscles in your body act at a particular angle that's not, parallel to the direction of motion. So in other words, the pennation angle here, this is the angle at which the muscle attaches to the tendon. Now, this is not the same as the attachment angle that we talked about in the first half of the class. This is the kind of the angle between the muscle and the tendon itself. Okay. And so if you remember from before too, so the tendon is a special kind of connective tissue in the body that connects your muscles to the bones. Okay, so the muscles don't attach directly to the bones. The muscle has to attach to a tendon, and then the tendon has to attach to the bone. Okay. Tendons are a little bit kind of special. They're almost kind of like a cartilage type of consistency. They're much harder than muscles. But the most important thing with tendons is that they have no active component. So a tendon can only, it's just kind of a passive attachment type of tissue. Okay. Okay. And so if you recall from last time, the pennation angle kind of determines how much of the force of the muscle forces component can actually be used to drive motion. Okay. So kind of the characteristic example that we talked about before was this kind of a special muscle where maybe you have an attaching tendon that's kind of in the middle like this. Okay. And then the muscle, or at least the muscle fibers, kind of attach obliquely to it like this. Okay. And so the pennation angle in this case would be this angle right here. Okay. So it's the angle that the muscle makes with its neighboring tendon. Okay. And so the force that the tendon experiences in this case which is the force that ends up being, transmitted to the bones or to the limbs to cause motion, okay, is equal to the muscle force. And in this figure, it's cosine of the pennation angle. All right, so you can see from this formula here that we need to take the pennation angle into account when computing the useful component of the force. Question is.
You said in this example, is that not for every example, or not always because of?
Yeah, so it depends on the exact geometry. So in this arrangement, it's the cosine here. But then we also have a lot of situations like for the muscle forces on the long limbs where that angle is just the muscle fibers are parallel to the tendon in that case. And so in that case, the pennation angle doesn't take into effect. Yeah. So kind of the more common case that I think we saw in a lot of our examples was, let's say we have a limb like this, and we have a muscle attaching here. Okay. And so the tendon is kind of this block at the end right here. And so in this case, the muscle fibers are kind of parallel to the tendon itself. And so the pennation angle here would be 0. Okay. And so just kind of a quick aside, right? So, obviously, the most efficient thing, is to have pennation angles of 0, close to 0. But that can't always happen. And the reason your muscles get pennated is that, for a configuration like this, right? Basically, the more a muscle is pennated in this case, basically allows your body to pack more muscle fibers into a smaller area of space. Okay. Okay. So sometimes, for certain parts of your body, certain limbs, the amount of space that you're given there is pretty limited. Like your shoulder joint is kind of one really interesting kind of example of this, just because it's a ball and socket joint, but the muscle has to kind of wrap around the joint in order for it to actuate it. So the amount of space there is small. So in order to kind of, for the shoulder joint to do everything that it needs to do, that your deltoid muscle needs to be very highly pennated in order for that to happen. Okay. So sometimes it's just out of necessity that, there's a small space, your muscle, your body needs that joint there to do certain ranges of motion. And so pennation is required in those cases to produce that. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay, cool. All right, so let's move on to the third parameter. Okay, so the third parameter is the maximum isometric muscle force. Okay. All right, so we give it the symbol big F, not M. Okay. All right. So the maximum isometric muscle force, this is basically the theoretical maximum amount of force that the muscle can generate if all the sarcomeres were engaged and you're in kind of the best with under the best conditions possible. Okay, so ideal conditions means that it is at its optimal length, right? So it's in that plateau region of the force length curve. It's at zero contracting velocity. So, that's the isometric part. Okay. Okay. So this parameter right here is usually actually very difficult to measure in practice. Just because there's very few motions that your body can do where you just have one muscle that's responsible for it. Okay? So even a simple motion of picking an object off the table, which you would think you're isolating your bicep muscles. You have a little bit of action from your shoulder muscles, a little bit of action from your forearm muscles. Your wrist kind of plays a role in there too. So it's very hard to isolate a single muscle, especially when you're talking about certain muscle groups that have multiple muscles that are kind of overlapping each other. So it's normally very difficult to measure this in practice. Okay? And in fact, it's so difficult that it's actually very rarely actually measured. So the way that we usually compute this quantity is we estimate it based on the cross-sectional area of the muscle. Okay. So remember, we kind of talked about that. We kind of talked about this idea, a few weeks ago as well, that you can kind of get a sense of how much force a muscle can exert just by looking at its cross-sectional area, right? Bigger muscles mean bigger force. That's kind of an intuitive thing that we kind of understand, right? Okay. So the exact formula that we have here is F0m is equal to something called the PCSA, where PCSA here stands for the physiological cross-sectional area. Okay. And then we multiply that by a quantity sigma 0m. Okay. Where the sigma 0m here is the peak isometric stress for a human muscle. Okay. So peak isometric stress is the maximum amount of force that a human muscle can generate per area. Okay. And this is fairly standardized across most people. Okay. So the value that we typically use for this is about 0.3 megapascal. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about the PCSA a bit more. Okay. So normally when we take a cross section, a cross section basically just means that you take a slice of whatever object that you're looking at and you take the area of that slice, right? So you have a cylinder here, right? You can take a slice like that, okay? And then if you look at the view from the slice, right? Then we take just whatever the area of that slice is, okay? Now, of course, you can kind of see from this image here that the exact area of the slice that you take depends on the angle at which you take the slice, right? And so if we take the slice like that, versus if we take the slice, with a slightly more perpendicular, okay? This is going to produce a different cross-sectional area. Okay. So what's the right way to slice a muscle? Well, the nice thing about muscles is that, there is a sense of direction within the muscle that's determined by the muscle fibers, okay? So this physiological cross-sectional area, the way that we compute this is that we take a slice that's perpendicular to the fibers within that muscle. Okay. So if your muscle fibers kind of run, something like this, okay? The muscle fibers kind of almost tell you the direction of the outward unit normal of the slice, okay? So you want to slice this in a way such that the slicing plane here is perpendicular to all of your muscle fibers, okay? And that's mostly there just to keep the slices consistent, okay? And that basically just ensures that, the cross-sectional area that you capture is kind of standardized to the amount of sarcomeres that are within that slice, okay? Okay. And so all that basically means that, if you make the slice in this way, it basically just makes sure that, whatever you can basically directly correlate with the area of the slice that you take and the number of sarcomeres that are within that snapshot. Okay. Now, this is especially important, if you have muscles that have fibers that aren't parallel to each other. So you have a lot of muscles where, your fibers kind of run in kind of, similar directions, but not exactly all the same. And so you might have muscles that, like your back muscles are good examples of this, where, you might have muscle fibers that look something like this. And so, they're not all exactly parallel to each other. Okay. And so in this case, the physiological cross-section area is a little bit complicated because the slice that you have to take is actually not a straight slice. And so, the actual slice that you take here is actually going to be kind of a curved slice like that. Okay. And then what you do to compute the physiological cross-sectional area is that you take this curved slice and you kind of project it onto a flat plane. Okay. And then once you project it onto a flat plane, then you can use that to compute the physiological cross-sectional area. Okay. And again, all this is just to basically make sure that, all the sarcomeres are being cut in the same way, and you can directly correlate the whatever area that you get to, how many sarcomeres are within that snapshot. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. So this basically tells us that, muscles with a wider cross-section or a larger cross-section are going to be able to produce higher forces, okay? Okay. So let's see how this affects our force length curve and our force velocity curve. Okay. Okay. So the x-axis or the horizontal axis here, this is going to be length. And the vertical axis here is going to be force. Okay. Okay. So the difference I'm going to be drawing here is a difference between a very thin muscle versus a very wide muscle. Okay. So a wide muscle will have a much higher peak. Okay. And so wider muscles are just going to have more sarcomeres per cross-sectional area, okay? Or more, I would say, excuse me, more sarcomeres in its overall muscle. And so it's able to produce a much higher peak force, right? So the peak of this force right here is actually F0m, which is the peak isometric force, okay? And it just so happens, and so not every muscle kind of follows this trend in your body. There's certainly muscles that are very long and very wide. But generally speaking, the muscles that are wider tend to be the muscles that are shorter as well. Okay. So if you remember from the figure above, right, I said that shorter muscles tend to have a much narrower plateau, but their plateau reaches much higher as well. Okay. So this is a graph that shows the behavior for short and wide muscles. Right? So usually most muscles in your body kind of fall into that category. Okay. So muscles that are short and wide have a very high peak. They can produce a very high amount of force, but it can only do so in a very narrow band, in a very narrow kind of bandwidth of length. Okay. And so if you compare that to muscles that are more narrow, okay. So a narrow muscle is not going to have as many sarcomeres in its cross section in parallel because it's has a smaller cross sectional area. So its peak force is going to be small. Okay. But narrow muscles also tend to be longer in general as well. Okay. And so long, narrow muscles will tend to have, a smaller peak, but it's going to have a prolonged kind of optimal region because it's longer. Okay. So typically, if you kind of plot out the force length curves for a lot of muscles in your body, most either fall into one or two of these categories, or somewhere kind of in between. Okay. Okay, so that's the force length curve. Let's look at the force velocity curve. Okay. So the same trends are going to kind of apply here as well. Okay. So for wider muscles, shorter and wider muscles, you're going to have a higher peak. But just like we discussed with parameter 1, it's going to decay a lot faster. Okay. So let me go ahead and draw the graph here. Okay. I'll actually use colors this time. Okay. So this orange curve here will be a short and wide muscle. Okay, so you can see that it has quite a high peak. So this peak here is governed by F0m. Okay. Whereas a thinner muscle, a thinner muscle will have a smaller peak, and so the maximum amount of force that it can produce will be smaller, but it can do so or kind of maintain this force over much higher velocities. Okay. So this right here is a long thin muscle. Okay. All right, so those two parameters there are linked, and so the maximum length and the maximum force, or excuse me, the optimal length and the maximum force are kind of closely related. Question, yes.
For your force velocity curve, now do fast switch and slow switch take into account, or is it solely just for configuration of the muscle?
So these curves right here are just kind of general curves for just the geometry of the muscle itself. You read my mind though, so actually fast switch and slow twitch are what we're going to go over next. That's the fourth parameter.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's get into that parameter then. So whether your muscle is fast twitch or slow twitch, has to do with the fourth parameter here, which we call the maximum contraction velocity. Okay. So the maximum contraction velocity is basically the maximum velocity that a muscle can contract with and still maintain some kind of force generated. Okay? So there are two main properties that kind of determine how quickly a muscle can contract. Okay. One that we've kind of discussed before, actually, it's right in the curve right above here, is the muscle's length. Okay. So that one's pretty straightforward. So, the longer a muscle is, the more sarcomeres it has in series with each other. And so the longer it is, the faster it can contract and still produce force. Okay. So the muscle length there has to do with the fact that, sarcomeres, the more sarcomeres that you have in series, just you can maintain force for higher velocities. Okay. The second factor here has to do with the fact that, muscle contraction is also kind of a chemically graded or chemically gated process itself. Okay. And so the second thing, the way that we kind of sum it up is we describe muscles as either fast twitch or slow twitch muscles. Okay. Okay. So the actual chemistry behind this is actually quite complicated. But in order for your muscles to initiate a contraction, if you remember kind of last time, we kind of mentioned that your nervous system kind of sends a signal to your muscles release some chemicals into the muscle itself, and those chemicals have to propagate through the muscle in order to trigger the power stroke for the sarcomeres. Okay. Okay. And so what that means is that, how quickly your muscles respond to a stimulus, also kind of depends on its chemical and electrical properties as well. Okay. And kind of the main thing that, that kind of facilitates whether a muscle is fast twitch or slow twitch is the presence of hemoglobin in the muscle itself. So hemoglobin, if you're not aware of what that is, hemoglobin is a it's a chemical in your body that's used to store oxygen. Okay. And so what tends to happen is that, when your muscles contract, part of the chemical process is that it requires oxygen to do that, at least in kind of a stable way. Right? Okay. And so it turns out that your slow twitch muscles have much more of these hemoglobin within their muscle structure. Okay. And so as a result, your slow twitch muscles are able to kind of sustain muscle contraction over longer periods of time, just because it has a much higher reservoir of this hemoglobin. Okay. And so your slow twitch muscles are generally the ones that have higher endurance. And so these are ones that can sustain contraction without getting fatigued. Okay. And so just kind of as a fun trivia, just because of the presence of much more hemoglobin within your slow twitch muscles, it kind of gives the muscles kind of a little bit of a darker appearance. And so when you're at the store and you're buying, chicken meat or something like that, dark meat is traditionally more of the slow twitch muscles of the animal. Okay. So on the other hand, your fast twitch muscles don't have as much hemoglobin. Okay. And so because of that, they can only basically contract in very kind of a short burst. And so they kind of use up all their oxygen really quickly and they use it kind of, all at once. Okay. So there's not as much oxygen available to your fast twitch muscles, but it's usually for your fast twitch muscles, the oxygen is in such a way that it's very easily consumed by your muscles. Okay. So your slow twitch muscle stores more oxygen, but it's a little bit harder to get the oxygen within the muscle itself. And so that's kind of the difference between the two. So fast twitch muscles, they don't have that much endurance, and so they can only contract in short bursts. But because the oxygen is so readily available, it does so very, very quickly. Questions?
So does the fast twitch like use all of the hemoglobin or it just uses a lot and it also doesn't have a lot?
It uses more kind of I would say per second, I guess, so the rate at which it consumes hemoglobin is faster, and there's just not that much available in there as well. And so what happens with your muscles that if you kind of push contraction and you don't have as much of the hemoglobin, the oxygen available, then your muscles produce something called lactic acid. So it's kind of a byproduct of pushing your muscles, when there's not all of these kind of chemical reserves available, and that's what causes your muscles to get sore. So your fast twitch muscles it's a little bit easier for them to produce lactic acid. So they're able to kind of produce or contract in short bursts and do so, without that much consequence, I guess, or without the oxygen, I should say. Yeah. And because your fast twitch muscles, they don't have all of the hemoglobin, then they appear kind of wider as well. So white meat, that the kind of what we consider is due to the lack of hemoglobin. Okay. One interesting thing though is that, for humans at least, and for, a lot of other animals as well, you can't really characterize one specific muscle as having all fast twitch or all slow twitch muscles. In reality, a lot of the muscles that you have in your body have a combination of fast twitch and slow twitch. So there may be certain fibers that, are fast twitches because they don't have a lot of hemoglobin versus, slow twitch as well. So I think, so poultry is kind of the exception, where just kind of the way that they evolved, where they have huge sections of their body which is all fast twitch muscle, all slow twitch muscle. But for humans and for cows and for pigs too, like, we're not really like that. Okay. Now, certain people have a higher percentage of fast twitch muscle. Those are the ones that you see, probably doing the track and field, events at the Olympics. And so just the way that kind of that their body could have developed, they have a lot more fast twitch muscles in their legs and their arms. And so it allows them to do, run as fast as a car. And so, that's another way that we kind of vary genetically, and kind of why you see kind of a much, a very wide ranging kind of athletic ability between different people. Different people that are, that may have a similar build, but certain people may be able to jump a little bit higher, run a little faster. That's due to kind of how their muscles have this mix of fast versus slow twitch. Question.
So like fast twitch would be good for sprints, but not good if you wanted to run a marathon.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Different things for different tasks. Yeah.
Fast twitch or slow twitch, like change the overall appearance of the muscle?
Technically it does, but usually they're so intermixed that it's hard to really kind of get it's hard to really look at a muscle like, oh, that's mostly fast twitch or that's mostly slow twitch. It's so intermixed for humans that it's hard to tell. You can only really tell in poultry because it's, just because of the way that their muscles develop. Yeah. Any other questions on this? Okay. All right, so let's get to the final parameter here, although there's not much for us to really discuss here. The fifth one actually has to do with the tendons. Okay. So this is the fifth parameter that has to do with muscle performance. So the fifth parameter is what's known as the tendon slack length. Okay. So I'm not going to say too much on this just because, we're kind of skipping that section in the notes in terms of, how to model kind of a muscle contraction. But, I'll just kind of explain this parameter here a little bit qualitative. Okay. So like I mentioned before, your muscles don't attach directly to your bones, not to your joints. And so your muscle is attached to a tendon and the tendon attaches to the bone. Okay. Turns out there's variation in terms of the properties of the tendon in your body. And that variation can be very large as well. Okay. And so tendons tend to come in kind of two kind of categories. And so you have what's called a stiff tendon versus a lax tendon. Okay. Okay. So the difference between these two, have an effect in terms of how your muscles kind of enact motion. Okay. So kind of the simplest case actually is to have a stiff tendon. Okay. So stiff tendons are basically, you can almost consider them to be rigid objects. And so for a stiff tendon, when a muscle produces force, then a stiff tendon basically transmits that force directly to the limb without any kind of delay. Okay. And so what we can say is that for a stiff tendon, whatever force that a muscle generates is transmitted to the limbs, instantly. Okay. And so the analogy that I'd like to kind of, think of here is, let's say that you're trying to open a door. Okay. But for some reason, the door is, you can't touch the doorknob directly, right? And so in order to open the door, you attach something to the handle, right? So maybe some kind of, insulating material, okay? So let's say we have kind of a gripper here, okay? And so you're pulling on this handle, right? And so how quickly you can open the door will depend on the properties of this gripper, okay? So if this gripper is made of something that's rigid, right? So let's say it's made of plastic, it's made of metal, then when you exert force, that force is exerted directly on the door handle, okay? And so you're able to basically open the door without any kind of delay or any kind of, issues. Okay. So that's the simplest case. And if we were doing modeling, if we were kind of going through the equations for this, a stiff tendon basically just means that we can kind of ignore the fact that tendon exists. And so whatever kind of muscle force that, or whatever force that your muscle generates goes directly onto the joint. Okay. Okay. So the opposite of this is that if we have a lax tendon. Okay. And so basically the upshot for a lax tendon basically means that whenever your muscles generate a force, there's going to be a little bit of a delay between when that force gets generated and how much of that or how quickly that gets transmitted to the joint. Okay. So going back to our analogy of the door up there, right? And so let's say that instead of a gripper, you instead are using a slinky here. Okay. So a slinky, is basically just a very, very lax spring, right? And so eventually, you pull on a slinky, eventually the slinky is going to catch up to your hand here, but there's kind of a long delay. And so it's the same thing for the door, right? And so if there's any kind of laxity in like a string or kind of a, like a weak spring that you're using to pull on the door, you can pull on it, and then eventually that force will get transmitted to the door, but there's going to be some delay, okay? And so if you have a lax tendon, this kind of affects, well, it affects a few things. And so the main thing is that it affects kind of the responsiveness of the joint relative to the muscle itself. So it affects things like your contraction velocity and things like that. Because in order for the muscle force to transmit to the joint, the tendon itself has to kind of stretch, and that takes time. And then it's only after that the tendon stretches does the muscle get transmitted. Okay. Okay. So those are the 5 parameters that we have. So we have the optimal fiber length, we have the pennation angle, we have the maximum isometric force, we have the contraction velocity, and the tendon slack length. And so, kind of in closing here, I will say that, these 5 parameters here, they're still, they're still kind of a subject of research. So scientists are still kind of coming up with kind of good ways to measure these things. But based on these 5 parameters here, we have pretty well developed models that we can use to kind of characterize a muscle, okay? Kind of the difficulty here is that for a lot of these parameters here, they're very hard to measure without kind of cutting open a person. And, you can really only do that on cadavers. But, cadavers going to have their own difficulties as well because of, rigor mortis and things like that. So that's going to affect, certain things in your body as well. All right. Any questions on this? Yeah.
Oh, with your stiffness and laxness, is that dependent upon usage or lack thereof?
That's a great question, actually. It does change with time. So typically what happens for most people is that your joints and your cartilage and your tissue, they get stiffer as you age. And part of that may be due to fatigue. Just older people just use their muscles and tendons a lot more. But I think the jury is still out in terms of, the direct correlation of, fatigue damage versus stiffness properties. Yeah. Because we do know that, as people age, a lot of the collagen within your body kind of gets depleted. And the collagen usually is what kind of gives, your tissue a lot of flexibility. Yeah, question.
Does the lifespan, does it kind of use the same property as the stretch cycle as like your muscles?
It does. So they're similar. Your muscles are kind of more, so their muscles have the active component as well. And so that's very different from the tendons. So the tendons have no way to produce force on their own. So structurally, chemically, they are different than the muscles, but they're still soft tissue. And so they still exhibit kind of similar properties, just modified just because they can't produce their force. But the way that we characterize kind of the elastic properties for tendon passively is very similar to how we characterize it for muscles. Yeah. Okay. All right, so for the last 20 minutes of class today, I did want to move on to kind of the next big topic. Okay. So we're done with talking about muscles for now. And so we're getting back to kind of more kind of engineering kind of calculations type of stuff. Right. So the next big unit that we'll probably spend the entirety of next week talking about is human motion kinematics. Okay. So kind of, taking a step back, remember this whole unit that we're going over, that we're going to be covering until the end of the semester is all about human motion, right? So how do we describe human motion? How do we quantify it? How do we perform analysis on it? Okay? So of course, one big role in this, or one big kind of component is, how do we actually describe, a human moving, right? So when I kind of move my arms like this, how do we actually describe it in a quantitative way for us to perform analysis, right? Because that's always the first step when you perform analysis is to, figure out how you're going to quantify it, how you're going to describe it. Okay. So it very much plays the same role as kind of kinematics in your traditional kind of physics or, or your dynamics courses, right? So before we can do anything, talk about forces or stuff like that, we have to describe its position, velocity, acceleration, all that stuff, okay? Okay, so for human motion, okay, the main way or the standard way that we describe the kinematics of human motion is through angular kinematics. Okay. And so in particular, we're going to be looking at the joints. And so we want to be able to describe, the instantaneous joint angle, the joint angular velocities, and joint angular acceleration. Okay. So the reason we do this, as opposed to kind of traditional kind of linear kinematics, is the fact that, you know, your human body is an interconnected, you know, body, right? So your arms are connected to your shoulders connected to your torso, right? And so the motion of one particular segment of your body is dependent on the motion of the other parts of the body that it's connected to, which is dependent on the motion of the parts of the body that it's connected to, right? Okay. And so, you know, it wouldn't be really appropriate, you know, for me to kind of swing my arm around like this, right? It wouldn't really be appropriate to kind of track just the motion of the center of mass of my hand, right? Because that's one way that you can track kinematics. One way you can track kinematics is to take the center of mass of whatever object that you're considering and just track its position over time and track its, you know, linear velocity and acceleration over time, okay? So that's one thing you can do. So, you know, you can take my hand here and kind of trace out its path. But that wouldn't exactly be, you know, appropriate, just because, you know, my hand here is connected to my wrist is connected to my lower arm is connected to my, you know, upper arm, connected to my shoulder, and so on and so forth. And so just this simple motion of me kind of waving my hand around, you can see that it involves all of these parts of the body right here. And so, you know, the standard way that we kind of express this in, you know, for our analysis is to talk about, you know, what is the angular motion, the angular kinematics of the joints themselves. Because if we can describe the angular kinematics of the joints, then we can kind of understand, you know, the entire motion of the body as it goes through, you know, all these different kind of complex motions. Okay. Okay, so this unit here is all about, you know, how do we measure these things, first of all? So I think that's kind of what we'll just talk about today, is just kind of generally how people kind of measure these. And then we'll go into some calculations in terms of how we can actually take, you know, some standard measurements and transform them into, you know, quantities that we can actually use for analysis. All right, any questions on that? Okay, all right, so let's start with some measurement techniques. Okay, so we're gonna have a little bit of a history lesson here, right? So we're gonna go over just a little bit of the history in terms of how scientists have measured human motion in the past, okay? Okay, so, you know, it didn't take, you know, humans very long to kind of realize that human motion is very complex, right? And so it's a fully three-dimensional motion, you know, and there's kind of very complex, you know, rotations and movements within the human body. And so, you know, scientists actually struggled for a really long time to kind of think about, you know, what's the best way to kind of even capture human movement so we can analyze it, okay? Because, you know, up to a certain point, you know, in scientific development, humans were kind of figuring out how an object fell from a tree or how a boulder kind of rolls down from a slope. And so compared to those things, you know, human movement was a lot more complicated. So kind of the earliest, the earliest kind of attempts to kind of measure kind of biological movement happened in the 1800s, and it kind of coincided with the invention of photography. Okay. And so kind of the benefits of photography is that you can take a snapshot of a person and kind of capture and kind of use that snapshot to measure every single kind of joint motion or joint angle within their body. And you can take kind of multiple snapshots, multiple photos at different points in time, and you can use those to kind of, back calculate and kind of, reconstruct a motion. Okay. So I think one of the most earliest kind of documented case of this happened in 1872. Okay. And so in 1872, what scientists did was they used photography to capture the motion of a horse, galloping from one end of the track to the other. So they set up kind of a series of cameras, and they set them all along the track of a horse, and they had the horse just gallop from one end to the other. Okay. So that study right there, so those pictures of the horse galloping, this was kind of the start of the development of what we understand to be gait biomechanics. Okay. Because it's from these photographs that people start to see that as someone, or as a horse in this case, runs, there's phases where the hooves or the legs are in contact with the ground. There's a swing phase where the leg kind of follows this kind of exact trajectory. And in this case, there's actually a flight phase as well. So there was a part of the motion where none of the horse's hooves were on the ground. And we started to correlate that with the way that humans walk, that humans run, and all that stuff. Okay. Okay. And so eventually, this became the standard for a while. And so, photographs were used, and eventually videos were kind of used to track human motion and to study it. Okay. One really interesting breakthrough occurred through the development of what's called inertial measurement units. Okay. So this is, we kind of fast forward, maybe about 130 years at this point. So inertial measurement units are these kind of small devices that are able to measure directly kind of the acceleration and velocity of a certain, of the device itself. Okay. So these devices consist of an accelerometer. So the accelerometer, if you don't know what that device does, is that it's able to measure, based on, just the device itself, it's able to measure the whatever acceleration that it's going through. Okay. It contains a gyroscope. Okay. So a lot of smartphones nowadays have a gyroscope. I think probably all of them do. Okay. So gyroscopes are devices that are used for measuring angular velocity. Okay. So your phones use a gyroscope nowadays to kind of, tell which way that it's oriented. Okay, so when you turn on your GPS, a gyroscope is used to kind of tell which direction that you're walking in. Okay. And the third one is it's basically a compass. Okay? The exact device is called a magnetometer, but that's just a very fancy way of saying there's a compass. So a compass basically it's a device that always points towards the magnetic north. So it knows what direction that you're facing on the globe itself. Okay. So this was a big breakthrough because these IMUs were able to be manufactured and be really small. Okay. And so what scientists were able to do is that they were able to take these IMUs. Well, they're in all of our phones now, and so you can see that they're kind of ubiquitous. But people were able to put these inside inside shoes, attach them to clothing, and so this kind of was a breakthrough in terms of how finally we can measure things. And we actually get kind of an exact kind of digital reading in this as well. Compared to before from the photographs and the videos, you kind of had to rely on a scientist going onto the photos and videos and kind of directly drawing the angles. It depends on how they interpret it. So this was kind of a nice kind of standardized way to kind of compute these quantities. Okay. And so in some sense, this kind of eliminated kind of the human aspect of taking measurements. And so it's kind of a direct kind of standardized way. And it also allowed, it was also a lot easier for scientists to kind of measure motion and measure kinematics in a natural environment. So, you didn't have to worry about kind of a camera setup or anything like that. You can just kind of track people naturally. Okay. So IMUs are still a very big part of biological human kinematic studies today. Okay. But kind of the new kind of toy that kind of everyone's been playing with nowadays is called optical motion capture, and that's going to be kind of the focus of our discussion as well. Okay. So optical motion capture kind of takes its inspiration more from kind of the early days of studying biomechanics, right? And so the early days, we relied on cameras and photographs and videos to kind of capture the motion that way. And so optical motion capture kind of takes that same approach. Okay. And so basically the idea with motion capture is to capture a person's movement with a lot of high definition cameras. Okay. So actually, the fact that we have to rely on optical cameras, actually does play a difference in terms of how we design our studies, and so we'll talk about that next week. Okay, but what makes motion capture kind of different from the previous methods was that we get some aid, or we get some boost through the use of devices like IMUs. And so the idea is that, whoever is going to be the subject of a motion capture study to kind of wear a specific suit. You've probably seen people wear these kinds of suits. They're kind of a, kind of a suit that's all one color. It's very snug, I guess you can say. And on top of the suit, we attach all of these little kind of reflective markers that are kind of easily tracked by the camera. Okay. And so, what it looks like is that, you may have a person like this, okay? They're wearing a particular mocap suit. And then what you see on their skin is all these little, markers out here, okay? So usually these suits are designed in a way where, there's the outside of the suit is made of Velcro, and then, these trackers kind of attach to the person's suit by Velcro. Okay. Yeah, question.
Kind of like those suits that you see in like movie outtakes when it's like a CGI person that has like a bunch of dots on them.
It's exactly like that. It's actually exactly the same technology. So actually mocap, and so, I don't know the exact actually origins of the technology, but it's heavily used in entertainment for like movies, video games, things like that. But we can actually use that exact same technology to measure things like joint angles, joint velocities. And so what we're going to go over next week is actually specific techniques in terms of, where do we actually place the markers? How do we actually get measurements, and how we can actually turn that into something useful for doing analysis. So, but yeah, we'll do that next week because we are out of time today. Any final questions on this before we head out? Okay. All right. So when we pick this up next week, we will talk more about motion capture. We'll talk about how it's set up, and we'll do some calculations today. So thank you guys for coming today. Hope you guys have a good weekend and a good rest of your day, and we'll see you guys next week. Oh, if you're here, I have your exams. So if you haven't picked up your exams yet, after today, I'm not going to bring them to the lecture anymore. So you have to come to my office to pick them up. Okay. Yeah.
So I'm seeing my doctor for my shoulder this Friday. And so
Okay.
I have a few questions.
Sure.
So,
Okay.
I guess just in terms of like actually what kind of questions would you ask? Yeah.
Oh, well, how did it hurt?
I guess the main thing is like, I guess it's like, in like stretch position, is like when the pain goes away after like then like just the initial like stretch, is it because of like the scar tissue breaking up?
I see. Well, I'm not a doctor, so technically I can't diagnose you. But I mean, I would definitely describe, exactly what emotions are causing you pain. Because that's going to be really helpful for the doctors.
Yeah.
Because it could be, it could be a lot of things. So it could be your muscles, your joints. Probably it might be your tendons or your bones, but that's pretty unlikely. Probably something with your muscles.
Okay.
So those are much more likely to get hurt. And so I would definitely start with, like describing, and showing, these exact motions of pain, telling the motions that, that make it feel better, feel better. It seems like it feels better after you kind of warm it up a little bit too. So that sounds like a muscle thing to me.
Okay.
And then, and then he'll be able to kind of, he has his own questions to kind of say as well.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then so I was doing tire flips 2 days ago.
Yeah.
And then I felt like this side of my knee kind of popped.
Oh.
But like I've been doing like pistol squats and like just moving around and like doesn't necessarily hurt per se, but
Okay.
like does that sound like that's not a tendon tear or anything like that?
No, well, a pop can be a lot of different things. So usually pops aren't good. So usually pops is some kind of, some kind of, maybe tear or something in the soft tissue, like ligaments or something like that.
Okay.
But it also could just because your joints have a lot of like air in them naturally. So, when you crack your knuckles, crack your knuckles, that's just the air getting released from there. So it could have just been something like that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably the doctor will ask, have you experienced pain in there again after that? So if you've been doing other stuff with it, it's probably okay. It's probably just maybe just the joint just releasing a lot of air. Like that.
Okay. So like a spring kind of?
Maybe, yeah.
Okay.
Usually it's probably where if you hear a pop in a joint and then that joint kind of feels loose. So I've hurt my knees actually quite a lot, playing sports and stuff. So I've heard it pop, and then immediately afterwards, it feels very like loose. Like,
Yeah.
there's just not a lot of stability there, so that's, you know, that's usually when you have either, you know, your ligament may either stretched or might have torn a little bit too. But if it just pops and but you're able to kind of do stuff again after that, it's probably nothing to worry about, but, yeah, I would mention to your doctor.
For sure, because like, when I do, like barbell squats or anything like that, I kind of warm up, but like, similar to cracking your knuckles, I let my knees crack, so I kind of go on the balls of my feet, and kind of like.
Oh, yeah.
So, okay,
Yeah, this might be something like that, but yeah, worth mentioning.
got it. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.